Okay, thank you very much. We're going to reconvene with our last panel. The concept of resilience has come up multiple times today. Resilience and system safety, and there are a whole lot of overlaps between our panels. But this final panel is going to address the resilience issues full bore, and I hope you're going to introduce the panelists. Okay, that's what we decided. That's great. People are still coming in here. Our moderator, Katie Jereza, was at DOE as a Deputy Assistant Secretary. Did I have that right? And is now at EPRI, and has graciously agreed to moderate this panel. And I wish all our moderators were as great at preparation as Katie has been. So I think this is going to be a terrific presentation. We'll close after this panel with a few short observations and a thank you to those who worked so hard to make it possible. And Katie, why don't you take over?
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me here and the opportunity to moderate this esteemed panel. Very exciting to close the day. As you heard this morning, Ernie Moniz kicked it off talking about the interconnected nature of the grid and its inherent resilience. So you've got redundancies and the ability to network. And but at the same time, it also gives the opportunity for like a widespread blackout, like you talked about in 2003. So there's also, and Wires had a really good paper that talked about the opportunities of transmission and in terms of resilience. And so this panel today, I feel like we had a really good build-up to get here. Mike Hyland pointed out that we hadn't talked about cybersecurity yet, and so we will be talking about that here. They did touch on that a little bit. And so the key questions we're going to talk about are, what is a resilient grid and is it resilient today? And Chuck will tee us off in framing that for us. And so to my left is Chuck Hookam. He's with the American Society of Civil Engineers. He's the executive director of CMS Energy. And then we're going to also frame the current situation in terms of risks. So what are the threats to achieving grid resilience? And for that, we've got Terry Boston, who's the principal Grid Protection Alliance and former CEO of the PJM Interconnection. And next we'll have Alex Foord. He's the Chief Information Officer and Vice President of Engineering Standards at IESO, Ontario, Canada. And then we will also talk about policy opportunities, well, not policy opportunities, but in the context of critical infrastructure protection. We've got Howard Google, who's the Vice President of Engineering and Standards from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. And then to get a planning perspective, and also from the Midcontinent independent system operator, we've got the President and Chief Operating Officer, Clair Moeller, who will help to wrap up the situation, thinking about all the different moving parts and different stakeholders. How do we plan for this future resilient grid? And so when we're done, we'll try to tease out some capstone themes that we would like policymakers to consider, and that'll help us to close out the day. So thanks for hanging with us. And to kick us off, we're going to have Chuck frame our resilience panel for us. Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jim and Wires, for having me. This is an honor and a privilege to be here as well with ASCE sponsoring this, and being a part of this is really important to us all. ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, puts out what's called the Infrastructure Report Card. This is what it looks like. This is an executive summary. Those of you that are interested, it's online at infrastructurereportcard.org. You can also download an app for those of you using your phones a lot. This document's been used in Congress. It's been cited by the President's team. Emily and Anna from ASE do a great job of helping us get this pulled together. It deals with 16 different infrastructure sectors, so anything from airports and roads to bridges, dams, things that civil engineers typically get involved in, whether it's in a design phase or construction. And so when people talk about energy, people don't usually talk about civil engineers per se. It's sometimes not understood, but civil engineers really are the backbone of construction, and particularly in the way of our transmission distribution grid. I've been doing it for 38 years. We've been doing it since the first lines were pulled back at the start of the century. So, long legacy of civil engineers being involved. If you look in the report card gives the energy sector a D, actually a D plus this time around. And if any of you have been in school and brought home a D plus, there was a little bit of explaining that had to be done, right? So the D plus in energy was really interesting in the sense that this covers way beyond wires. It covers all of our energy infrastructure. It covers oil and gas. It covers the electric wires, generation, trends, policy. Everything about energy really gets graded in this document. We looked at a lot of different things, including existing capacity, its condition. Funding is really crucial. Are we funding it properly to move forward into the future? Operation and maintenance. Obviously, innovation and resilience are key parts of that. So really critically, we look at all those pieces of the pie. And there's a team of experts that look at it from an energy point of view. Transmission was looked at. Obviously, this is a transmission-related summit. Transmission is interesting because it's hard to decipher exactly when we have an outage or other form of metric what caused it. So we did a deeper dive on it and found that the average customer or average resident sees about 4 to 6 hours of outage a year. So if you do the math on that, it's a 99.9% reliability dedicated to transmission. So, you know, in reality, transmission is very resilient. And I'm on CMS's storm team. I face this every day. I face the resilience question every day. I deal with storms. We've had serious storms this year. We've also supported storms in other states like Florida. If you look at the damage and you look at the cause, you look what happened, it's not the transmission system that's the challenge right now, it's distribution. And so when we start talking about resilience, we need to start there. And there's issues out there on our distribution side, such as we design oftentimes distribution to a National Electric Safety Code minimum standard. Well, there's a 60-foot exemption, so distribution lines, which are typically under 60 feet, are exempt from severe storm type loadings. And every time we go through a storm in Michigan lately, it's all of our poles are snapping, our lines are being hit with debris. We have tremendous damage caused on our distribution side. So when we start talking about lack of resilience or lack of resilience in our customers' eyes, which are really critical, that's where we really need to start. And I've been involved in the whole gamut from generating all the way through delivering to our customers. The one thing we used to think of as a utility was, we know how to do it, we'll get it right, we'll deliver it to our customers, they'll like it. That's not a really great model. So we've totally flipped it over now. We're asking our customers, what do you want? How do you value resiliency? How do you want your power to start when you flip your switch in the morning? What happens if you have a blip? Do you have any concerns with that? And that whole concept of resiliency then starts to pop up into a really interesting equation. The graph you see on the right-hand side of the slide here came out of a workshop or a task force that NERC started on severe impacts. And you can use this kind of a graph to help train. We talked about training in this summit. Crucial that people know what we're talking about. When we say resilience, a lot of people just look at me like, I don't want to, what is that? I don't know what that is. You can use a graph to really tell people how that works. And this severe incident type graph shows you resiliency is really preparing, mitigating, and restoring in a reasonable amount of time back to some standard that's acceptable. If we don't prepare correctly and we don't have a resilient grid to start with, mitigating and restoring are terrible. It takes forever. The blackout in 2003 was an example, not understanding what happened, not knowing what we had to mitigate, trying to restore in a reasonable amount of time, and not being able to communicate. So the communication piece really challenged us, and that's something that came out of this NERC study. We've got to do a better job of communicating. We've got to do more in the sense of letting people know what's going on, when's a reasonable time to restore, when is power coming back on, when can life resume, or else we'll have challenges going forward. What are the potential impacts of not having that resiliency? We don't have a lot of data. We have individual customers saying, well, it's $20,000 an hour. Well, that doesn't help us when we start talking about a regional event. So what we do is we look back at like the 2003 blackout and said, what happened? For 2 days, the Northeast got impacted. What was the impact of that? We've seen statistics ranging from $6 to $10 billion for 2 days. So if we start thinking about an impact that lasts longer than that, we're talking about some pretty significant impacts. That was back in 2003. We're so much more connected now, we have to do something better. Strengthening our grid is crucial, particularly as we get into the electrification step. So really thinking about that as an important pathway to success, we really have to start focusing on our transmission, distribution, and delivery. So what's our current conditions and what are the needs for resilience? We have 200,000 miles of transmission, high voltage transmission, United States only, and I've worked in Canada, they have a lot too. We have 5.5 million miles of distribution. That's a lot of wires that are in our infrastructure, most of which is 40, 50 years old. So now what are we going to do? We start talking about taking outages to expand that grid or to double circuit or to do things like that. Anybody talk about getting an outage on a 230 kV line lately? It doesn't really happen unless there's a pretty darn good reason to do that. There's significant redundancy and resiliency issues to take into account then. We have to do a better job of planning and forecasting, and that's really critical. We talked about interregional type delivery of power. Why not? It makes a lot of sense to me. The SEAM studies and all the information that's coming out of that has to be built into this whole pathway of what does this future grid look like? How do we get to resilience? I'll just show you one other quick slide and then I'll stop. My day job is resilience, and I put resiliency in a box for a reason. I work in a box, and if you look at all the items in there that I might have to check box and say we're resilient, good luck. You know, we start with things like life cycle cost or the cost to our customer. They don't want to pay any more for electricity. When I ask them, do you want resiliency that can withstand a geomagnetic pulse, and I try to explain what that looks like, there's no way they want to talk about that. That's just too expensive for them. That resiliency is not part of their equation. And yet, as soon as the storm impacts them, of course they're going to be in my face. Why isn't my power on? So the day-to-day type infrastructural challenges we have to be cured. Severe impacts we have to look forward into the future. As we start electrifying even further, those threats from cyber become a bigger challenge. So I'll look forward to Alex's comments on that front. Decarbonization is a huge part of our plan, and our CEO recently came out and accelerated the whole pathway to decarbonization. We're having to do this in a way that makes sense. We have a state in Michigan where we just built a 345 double circuit loop in the thumb where all our wind is, only to find out the residents don't want wind in their backyard. We don't want wind here. So we've got this half-used, great thumb loop. It's got a great capacity in it, not available because we can't use it to tap into resources that are there. So we're actually going to build solar in the middle part of our state, more palatable to the locals. Farmers seem to like it. We're going to work that path to get to a successful decarbonization strategy. And lastly, we're really driving the electrification. That's got to be a part of the equation going forward. We're looking forward to the challenges that brings, but we know that a resilient grid and transmission distribution system is crucial going forward. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chuck, for giving us a little bit of the state of where we are. And as you might have recalled, when Carl was speaking during the last panel, he was talking about different risks to the grid and the different threats, and that we might need to expand our thinking a little bit to the traditional reliability risks that we have. And so that's why we have Terry here who will expand our minds on the threats of today. So, Terry?
When Jim Hecker or any former or current commissioner calls you and asks you to do something, you normally do it. So when Jim called me, I quickly said, yes, I would love to be here. And I said, what do you want me to talk about? He said, I want you to talk about 7 minutes. So to do that, I'm going to talk faster than a guy from Gordonsville, Tennessee normally would talk, but I want to bring some points forward that are pretty clear to this audience. When the National Academy of Engineering was asked to put together what were the top 10 engineering accomplishments, achievements of the last decade, they put together the number one, electrification of the grid. Nothing has improved our standard of living more. Nothing has improved our productivity more than electricity at the end of the day. But if you look at the other 9, 6 of the 9 are powered by electricity, and we're working very hard on electrification of transportation. Transportation now produces more carbon than the grid, than all of the electric in the U.S. And so when you think about where are we going from here, a robust, and I use that word instead of dumb, where's Charles? A robust grid, a reliable grid, and a resilient grid is not rocket science. It's much more important than that, because life as we know it depends on that. And I'm going to take you to a NIAC study that has been released to the President. NIAC is National Infrastructure Advisory Council that I sit on. It reports directly to the President of the United States without going through any of the federal agencies, and it's coordinated by DHS, but we report to them. And we were asked by the National Security Council, what would we do if there was, what should the federal government do, not we, but the federal government do for a long duration catastrophic power outage? Think of the August 14, 2003, double the size of it to 50 to 100 million people. And think about Puerto Rico, that it's months to a year instead of 2 days, like the August 14, 2003 blackout. So we were asked to talk about what are we going to do if there is that kind of catastrophic outage, and what should the federal government's role be? Now, this is beyond anything by definition that we've ever seen before. It's beyond what mutual aid can do to help you. We moved, in the case of the hurricanes in 2017, we moved 60,000 electrical workers into Florida. In the case of Superstorm Sandy, we moved 65,000, the largest mobilization in the history of any storms, into the PJM New York territory during that. So we're not talking about the top line here. We're not talking about a New Madrid earthquake being fairly local. We're talking about something that takes out the grid. Now, NSC did not tell us why they asked us the question. We didn't have a need to know what the cause was, but they asked us to take a very firm look and make recommendations to the federal government. So we're talking about something like a solar event. We had one in 2013. Thank heavens it was perpendicular to the Earth direction. If it had not been, we would have probably lost the grid for an extended period of time, hopefully not months, but some of the equipment would have been damaged. We're talking about a cybersecurity event, and we're talking about potential EMP threat or other severe events. The derechos, interesting enough, that hit Washington, D.C. in June of 2012. It was 200 miles wide, 600 miles long. It knocked out about 4.2 million people, so it doesn't meet the number. But never have I seen a storm with that intensity, with that kind of footprint in the area. So we actually suffered through 3 1-in-100-year events in about an 18-month period there through time. So we talked about artificial intelligence and where we're going in terms of cybersecurity. Before we get to artificial intelligence, I'd like to see some intelligence first. Here's how I see the Internet of Things. It's a ugly, ugly picture. This is, there will be a cyber threat. I went to work the Hill at lunch today, and the first question is, how serious is the cyber security threat that we have? There will be serious cyber implemented on us if there is a military event. And I might add, Blattner Energy is a board that I sit on, an advisory board They're really a construction company doing about $1.7 billion worth of build out of solar and wind. Because our name is Energy, we get hit more than anyone else in terms of the construction business. So beware, the cyber is a risk that we face. Anybody see the problem here? Here are the substations we need to protect. There's 42,000 in the U.S., a little over 60,000 on this drawing. And I have had the pleasant chore of being involved in Canada in two ways. Terry Vandell at Hydro-Quebec flew me up at my request to look at how we could use the Canadian hydro as the Norway is to Germany of storage for our wind and solar integration. We flew 2.5 hours to the last airport and then 2 hours at treetop level in a helicopter to get to the northmost part of the Canadian hydro beyond James Bay in that area. It was a treat, and it is a real opportunity. That's the reason I was asking about HVDC lines coming out of Canada to help us regulate the wind and renewable. Norway is making a lot of money doing that for Germany, by the way, for those Canadians in the audience. Look at Alberta. I had the opportunity, I retired to Hawaii, got a little bit bored after 3 months, and I got a call to come to Alberta and work. Look at the number of substations in Alberta. Alberta passed a rule that there would be no difference in marginal cost. In essence, no LMP difference, no congestion, and they built out a robust system. It's much easier to run a robust system than one that's not robust, but from a cybersecurity perspective, from a physical security perspective, it's going to be tough to protect those against an attack, a physical attack to the grid. I'm going to hit very quickly. I have referenced the NIAC report. It's an easy read. It's less than 30 pages main body. Total report, including appendix, is about 100 pages. We interviewed some 50 people in the scoping study and the working group before we wrote the report with the recommendations to the President of the United States. Those recommendations are, number one is to examine and clarify who is in charge in the federal government. Clearly, DOE has the lead, but in an event that's lasting months, society is going to break down. How is DHS and FEMA and other agencies going to work? Where is DTRA, the Defense Risk Reduction Agents, involved in that process, and DOD facilities? How do we keep them up and doing mission critical activities if this occurs? We said, hey, we need to develop some criteria, kind of like NERC standards we were going to hear about. We need some criteria to design for this. And we need to have the communities involved in emergency preparedness. Probably the country that's the best prepared for emergency like this is Australia. I wouldn't have thought it. That they've hardened their grid. How many of you have 14 days of food in your storage facilities at home? Think about that. We're 3 days away from anarchy at any time in this country, 3 meals in some cases. So we need to have community, and I got a call from Wall Street Journal, enclaves like the Super Bowl was, if you'll remember the pictures coming from Katrina and where people land. If you've got this many people involved, you have to think about people staying in place. Where would you put this many people if you had to migrate? In the case of Puerto Rico, which I've worked on, about 350,000 people evacuated the island, migrated off the island, many of which will not return. The fourth recommendation is to make sure we have financial support for the resiliency that we heard from the American Society of Civil Engineers. ASCE has been very involved in the resilience. How do you get paid? If you get a D+, how do you have the things, at least how do you have the regulatory system that is not preventing you from doing the things you need to. We often know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Resiliency is something that will cost money, especially, and I might add, for the hurricanes that hit Florida, Andrew, 1992, took 28 days to put Florida back together. They changed the design criteria to 150-mile-an-hour winds. Following Maria and the other hurricanes that hit, it took 7 days to put Florida back together. The point, the transmission is getting more resilient, perhaps not distribution. We should drill these events more than Grid X. We do that at NERC every other year, but we don't drill with the National Guard for long duration outages and prepare the local communities for that. The one that's close and dear to my heart was number 6, and I've highlighted and underlined it. Natural gas traveling at 24 miles an hour. There's a very short period between just-in-time delivery and too dang late. We got caught with our plants down. Literally 40% of the gas plants, most of which were brand new, shiny combined cycle plants, did not have the winterization that was needed for the kind of, or the fuel supply. About half of that was fuel supply that was available during the polar vortex. Now in Alberta, they call the polar vortex winter. During winter before last, Alberta, where I had worked for 6 months, the wellheads froze and it was a minus 40 degrees C, which is about the same as a minus 4 degree F. So it was dang cold, and the wind chill takes the benefit of the heaters away. Develop support and adaptable communication systems that will ride through a solar storm, an EMP event. Dominion Resources here locally is expanding in that area. And the last, but I was pleased, point I wanted to make here is energy storage. We're the only commodity that doesn't have an inventory product at the end of the day. We're making great progress. I just came back from a Swedish battery manufacturer where I've been working for the last year and a half almost, and we have some major breakthroughs with 50,000 cycles measured. I love models, but measures are much better. Meters are better than models, and so we've actually have a battery hooked to the PJM system. It's inflammable in terms of the electrolyte is already fully oxidized, and inorganic electrolyte, it has no rare earth elements, and sodium can replace the lithium, and sodium is the 6th most abundant element. So literally for a battery to be cheap as dirt, it should be made with dirt, preferably local dirt. So the cost of the sodium is going to bring it down. Batteries are just like bacon. They make everything better. No matter where you place it in the system, and I'll say it is the Swiss Army knife that we're working on as far as the grid operator and the control center. I want to say for the California folks in the audience, if you can't store, you'll have no electricity after Foord. If you look at that duck curve changing 13,000 megawatts in 3 hours, I know of no operator, including PJM, that has those kind of ramp rates, and PJM is 2.5 times the size of California. So we need for resiliency to perfect the energy storage in the system. And I'll close with this thought. I think that's Jim Hecker there in the kilt to the left. Electricity, carrier of light and power, devourer of time and space, bearer of human speech over land and sea, greatest servant of man. I'll close where I opened. Nothing has improved our productivity more. Nothing has improved our standard of living more. So a long power outage is something that would be serious loss of life, and we need to heed what civil engineers are telling us in terms of building the resiliency in. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I think that gives us a good frame of reference for some of the threats that we face, including EMP and cybersecurity. And So Alex Foord, who's Chief Information Officer, is going next, and cyber is something that I think he has to think about every day. Not that we all don't, but it's definitely in his purview, and so he's going to touch on a little bit of that and threat information sharing and other challenges that we face. So, Alex?
Great. Thank you very much, Katie, and it's an honor to be here today to represent Ontario and the IESO. So I'm going to talk about resilience from a Canadian Ontario perspective, both extreme weather and cybersecurity. I'm going to articulate what we feel the call to action should be in this regard, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing in Ontario from both a grid operations and a cybersecurity perspective. So to start off, no question resilience is a hot topic and more relevant than ever due to extreme weather events and cybersecurity threats increasing in both number and complexity. I have a couple of interesting anecdotes I wanted to share. I did some research yesterday as I was preparing, both from an extreme weather perspective and in terms of cyber threats. So extreme weather events, so in the province of Manitoba, and they're still cleaning up, just literally 2.5, 3 weeks ago, they had a surprise winter storm. There were still leaves on the trees. It's cost them over $100 million just to restore the assets. That doesn't count lost business productivity. The thing I found surprising, and we say transmission isn't oft affected, they lost 38 transmission towers. They lost 3,000 poles, and at the peak of the event, 56,000 people were without electrical power. And that happened a mere weeks ago. So no question, these things come up when you least expect them. 100-year events now happening, on a practically a yearly basis. Interesting on the cyber side. We all know that cyber criminals are bad, but I was shocked to discover they're also mean-spirited. So I was doing a little research on the well-known Ukraine attack. Russians attacking the Ukraine nuclear facility. It's public knowledge, but it's not well known that there was actually programming logic that was part of the attack that disabled the protective measures on the equipment in the Ukraine plant. So once the power went out, they waited a little while. They blacked out all the computers, so there was no visibility from the control room into the assets running the facility. Then they tried to inject code that actually shut down all the protective mechanisms for overload conditions and all the automated breakers. And the intent of that was, as the panicked Ukrainian electrical engineers went and started flicking breakers to reactivate the system, they felt that highly likely they were probably going to make some mistakes and have overload conditions. And with all the protective mechanisms actually dormant, the experts believe the intent was to electrocute technicians and to blow up the physical assets from unprotected overload conditions. So luckily for them, they had the wrong computer addresses for the devices, and the attack didn't execute. But truly malicious, and this is the sort of situation that we have to deal with. So at the ISO, there's no clear right way we can see at this point to manage these sort of events, but there's certainly growing awareness that a reliable service depends on how system operators plan for high impact events. So Canada, much like everywhere else, we've experienced everything from tornadoes, ice storms, forest fires, flooding, as well as physical attacks on the transmission grid and cyber attacks on sector participants. So safe to say these sorts of attacks and these sort of weather events, they don't know any borders, and that's why it's important that we have venues like this where we can talk between Canada and the US. We're all in this together, and we're highly connected now, and we're only going to be more connected in the future. Some interesting statistics. So the Insurance Bureau of Canada did a study recently that there was nearly $2 billion of damage due to extreme weather events in 2018 alone. There was a United Nations report on disaster risk that identified that in the last 20 years, the financial losses from extreme weather events have increased 151%, and over that same period globally, $2.2 trillion of cost was related to extreme weather events. Not to be too bleak, but the cyber story isn't too much better either. So 2018 report from the Council of Economic Advisors indicates malicious activity cost the U.S. economy between $57 and $109 billion, attacking public and private entities across the whole gambit of attacks. It could be denial of service, data destruction, business disruption, and theft of intellectual and sensitive information. In Canada alone, businesses spent $14 billion to prevent, detect, and recover from cyber incidents. And we had 1 in 5 Canadian businesses reported that they were affected by a cyber incident. So if I had to say there was a call to action from this news, it would certainly be, if there was ever a time to invest in the hardening of critical infrastructure such as grids, it's now. Our collective goal must be to reduce the magnitude and duration of disruptive events. We need to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and rapidly recover. So what are some of the things that we're doing up in Canada and Ontario specifically to address some of these threats? So we'll start on the grid operations side. So the ISO is focused on how to deal with the low probability, high impact events by working with sector transmitters, distributors, and generators to create a power system resilience best practices white paper, which obviously we'd be happy to share at the appropriate time. But our expectation is this guide will be a good guidepost for future investment, and it's going to guide the ISO in design decisions for decades to come. But there needs to be some new standards, some new consideration given to how to manage these events. Lying between grid operations and cybersecurity, and it was mentioned earlier, for Ontario, the ISO is championing the GridX exercise. So for those who aren't familiar with GridX, and it executes in about 2 weeks from now, it's a war games, if you will, that allows participants to share ideas, experiences, and demonstrate how they would respond to simulated, coordinated physical and cyber attacks. And we've actually engaged the Government of Canada cybersecurity group to participate in attacking the grid in Ontario, so we can exercise some of the programs we've put in place with programs like Project Lighthouse, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So, what are we doing on the cyber side of the equation? So, as background, the ISO has a slightly unique role in that we're the only regulator, the only ISO that I know of that's been mandated by a regulator to provide a centralized cybersecurity sharing service to all transmitters, distributors, and generators in the province. Why we feel this is important and why the Ontario Energy Board has given us the mandate is we strongly believe that the best way to counter cyber attacks is by sharing intelligence and cyber resources widely and quickly. So this brings us to talking a bit about Project Lighthouse, and I was pleased to see it was referenced a couple of times in the last 2 days. So Lighthouse is a quick background. It's a collaborative project between the ISO and the Canadian Government Cryptographic Agency. It's a new, proven, enduring capability that delivers near real-time situational awareness, and it's now been rolled out to about 85%, from a coverage perspective, I should say, it covers about 85% of Ontario consumers, and it gives military-grade, internationally coordinated intelligence drawn from the network traffic of the Ontario ISO, transmitters, generators, and distributors. And I'll call it the distribution comment because in Ontario we have the same recognition. The generators and transmitters, they're large-scale operators. They're a pretty sophisticated lot, and we enjoy working with them. They have pretty high-grade protective mechanisms in place. The distribution network, however, is not. We have over 60 distributors in Ontario. Some of them are sophisticated. It ranges, down to operations that would be, less than 50 staff. So one of the guiding principles of Project Lighthouse was not just providing a value-added service to the large, sophisticated operators and coordinating across the sector. It was providing something ostensibly for free, right down to the lowest levels and the least sophisticated distributors in the Ontario sector. one of the benefits is, and the reason why we're happy we have 85% coverage, is an attack on any one participant as part of the program will be automatically analyzed. Flash alert would be sent to the ISO. We'll package around it electricity specific insights, as well as suggestions on remediations, which could be changes in firewall settings, it could be patches, it could be other corrective actions, and we will flash that broadcast out to the Ontario electricity sector community. And we also have coordinations down with the NERC EISAC, and we provide information sharing with NERC as well. So that's really my summary of what we think some of the critical elements are and what's going on in Ontario to address them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so next we have Howard Google, who's going to give his perspective in the context of critical infrastructure protection, and he's with NERC.
The humor won't be lost on most of you that a guy with the last name of Google is going to talk about cybersecurity. But, we'll set that aside for now. Most of you know that NERC has a robust set of standards that deal with many aspects around transmission and the grid, and especially as it relates to resiliency and with cybersecurity and other concerns. I'm not sure if Mr. Highland was on the wrong panel or if somebody paid him well to set up for our panel here, but some of the concerns that he expressed are certainly some of the things that we'll be talking about during this time. I echo his sentiment that we don't really have a common definition of resiliency, and the NERC board tapped one of our committees to try to come up with a good definition of resiliency that we could use internally as we talk through that. And they started with the NIAC basis for that, and it kind of augmented it a little bit. So I'll offer to you the idea of what came out of that, and it's kind of 4 outcome-based abilities as it relates to resiliency. One of them is robustness, which is the ability to absorb shocks and continue operation. Resourcefulness, the ability to detect and manage a crisis as it unfolds, and the detect part of that kind of brings in the cybersecurity aspect of it. Or can, certainly. Rapid recovery, the ability to get services back as quickly as possible in a coordinated and controlled manner, and taking into consideration the extent of damage. And then finally, adaptability, the ability to incorporate lessons learned from past events to improve resilience. So those 4 components are things that we talk about when we get together as NERC and as the industry gets together. That's kind of the 4 things that we wrap around that. So as I think about what are the impacts of cybersecurity and as it relates to the transmission grid, I'll admit I'm a recovering transmission planner. I've been in years of therapy, but I think I've finally gotten to the point to where I can see things from a little bit different perspective. And we have historically in transmission planning looked at planning the system from pretty much a siloed effort. I mean, the blinders are on. What is the most efficient way to build a reliable system, but didn't really look at things that are the other considerations for resiliency. So this system was never designed with an idea of a cyber attack or a physical attack in place. We historically looked at things from an economy of scale standpoint. So it made sense if you had a big substation to continue to put equipment in that substation and build out from it, because it was a good place to do all of your maintenance. You could concentrate your workforce there, and it was a convenient place to place transformers and do things. But now, as we begin to think about threat actors, both from a nation state standpoint, from a cybersecurity, and then also from a physical security standpoint, it probably doesn't make as much sense to put all of our eggs in one basket. So we're beginning to have conversations now, both at NERC and then with our industry partners, about should we start, and I'll use air quotes here, de-risking the system. Are there ways that we can take the existing system, and when we start planning, look for ways that we can, eliminate some of those common risks that are out there, and not get into a scenario where we have all of our eggs in one basket, if you will. I think that is probably the next area that we'll have to start looking at from the system. And so we have begun, even internally, starting to integrate cybersecurity and physical security folks in with our folks that normally look at planning and operations to try to get a holistic viewpoint about how our situational awareness is and where we should be looking at things for the future, and then also incorporating that into some of our reliability assessments going forward. How do we take all of those common concepts and put them in there? Another area that I think deals with the issue of cybersecurity is the whole emerging area of DERs and how these distributed energy resources can affect the grid. We know that as more and more of this generation begins to migrate from the transmission grid down into the distribution network, we begin to get into situations where our transmission operators and distribution operators have less visibility into those issues. They from 1 minute to the next, or from maybe 1 hour to the next, there's an issue about how much load is actually on the system, and if something were to occur, how would it affect the generation that's out on the distribution feeder? How would the loads be affected? We've also put in, there are certain things that we put on the system that are what we call the last gap efforts, if you will, to keep the grid together. And one of those is under frequency load shedding. And that has historically been done on a fixed standpoint. So you would annually or on some periodic basis figure out what the loads were on each of your distribution feeders, and you would go through and put a fixed trip point on each of those based on the load that's out there. As more and more generation becomes migrating onto these feeders, then from 1 minute, again, from 1 hour to the next, or various times, if you get to the point that you have to trip under frequency load shedding, you may not get the effect that you were expecting to. There may be less load, net load on that feeder than what you had actually planned for that shedding. And you may have to go much deeper into your under frequency systems in order to keep the system from falling apart. And so those are some things that we've had discussions on, and some of the concerns. We've spun up some different working groups at NERC to begin to look at this, not only just from a inverter-based resource standpoint, but we've even spun up a group that's the system planning impacts of distributed energy resources, and trying to figure out how do you put it in your models. What are our load models, and how should they be affected? Most of us are using load models in the system that were developed 30 and 40 years ago, and the load looks very different than it did back then. A lot less induction lighting, a lot less incandescent lighting. As we begin to migrate more toward LEDs and electronics in the home, that load model is vastly looking different from a power factor standpoint and from a perturbation standpoint. And so those are areas that we're seeing more research needs to be done in, and we need to look more at those effects. The other thing that I'll begin to look at too is a lot of these distributed energy resources have cyber implications, right? From an effective standpoint, they're mostly IP addressable so that it can be pulled together at a common point, so that the EEPROMs can be flashed if there's any kind of a hardware or software update that needs to be done. And so there are certain cybersecurity issues that need to be taken care of there. I was speaking at GridSecCon yesterday about supply chain, and the question came up about what are we doing about the Internet of Things? And boy, that's an even bigger issue than what even we're talking about DERs. At least with some of these generating resources that can be connected on the distribution system, we at least have a conversation to be able to allow interconnection or not allow interconnection, or at least to make sure that when it's put on there we understand the effects. When you start thinking about maybe thermostats that could be controlled using the Internet of Things, what could a foreign threat actor do if they were able to compromise some sort of a database on that and shut off and turn on air conditioners or heaters all at a coincident time? And what kind of an effect could that have on our system? It's when you start thinking about those things, you begin to lose sleep, and you begin to get terrified of all the effects that could happen in that. Those are kind of the things that are on our horizon. One other thing that I'll offer up, we recently spun up a group to start thinking about high impact EMP and how we can start looking at all the research that's out on that area and what kind of effects could be gained on the system on that, and how should system operators and transmission owners and the grid prepare for such events, and what should be put in place for that. So there's more to come on that. We keep that information on our website, and feel free to visit that and download that information. But I think that's probably the next area of a lot of questions that folks are going to have is how do you protect, not necessarily, well, one, how do you protect against an HEMP, but then how do you recover from it? How should you position the system so that you can recover from that scenario? That's pretty much what I had thought about this area.
Okay. Thank you, Howard. Okay, so next we have Clair Moeller with MISO, and as you've heard from our panelists, the issues are many, they're complex, they're crossing multi-jurisdictional boundaries, change is accelerating, we certainly don't want to be too dang late, and we're starting from a D+. So considering all of that, we're, for the most part, resilient and reliable at the transmission system. But then again, we're looking towards the future. So, Claire, tell us, how are we going to plan for that?
We're going to get there, sure. Well, first I want to talk a little bit about where we are. I don't usually argue for grades, but I might argue for grades here a little bit. We'll talk about the story of 3 polar vortexes in a row, and the lesson that says transmission is increasingly important to resilience. 3 polar vortexes ago, my neighbors at PJM were in deep trouble. The MISO market reacted to the emergency pricing and moved about 9,000 megawatts from our market into theirs without much prior planning, right? The systems that were in place allowed us to do that. 2 polar vortexes ago, I was in deep trouble. The southern part of our system, Little Rock, Arkansas, was 12 degrees. It doesn't get 12 degrees in Little Rock, Arkansas, like very often. But for the assistance of TVA, Southern Company, and SPP, we would have had a load shed event. Okay, transmission and the neighbors responding to that crisis avoided that problem. This last polar vortex was even more fun. I had 25% forced outage rate on the coal fleet, 25% forced outage rate on the gas fleet, 25% forced outage rate on the wind fleet, and a 25% forced outage rate on load modifying resources or demand response. January 31st, colder to pail of penguin poop, and nobody showing up. My good neighbors at PJM sent me 14,000 megawatts. No prior planning, because the systems were in place that allowed us to do that. I'd argue that that's resilient operations. Now, that's not a lot of investment in resilience, but relying on that transmission system that people before us built without planning criteria that said you need 14,000 megawatts of transfer capability. In fact, those 3 events that have happened within the last, 4 or 5 years, 2 of them within the last year, show that operators are still doing a pretty good job at using the assets they have in front of them to their maximum capability to maintain the system. So, well, we might get a D- in planning, we maybe get a better grade than that in operations. Operations does have to evolve fairly quickly. Mercury and air toxic rule was 2015 or 16. The MISO footprint retired about 13,000 megawatts of small coal-fired generation as a result of mercury and air toxics. We had one capacity shortage event from 2005 to 2017. It was in 2006. We've had 3 per year for the last 3 years. So the change in the fleet is causing challenges to resilience that is new to us and new to how to behave. Among the problems are the operator's tools tend to be built around expected problems, known contingencies. And we don't have tools that on an ad hoc basis work very well. And the fact that the market-to-market flow gates and those things were in place between us and SPP and between us and PJM is an example of that kind of tool that we need so that we can react to the situation as it unfolds, rather than pretend that we know what the situation is going to be and build a bunch of contingency plans around it. That ad hoc nature of studying the system in very short time cycles is something that we're going to have to build if we're going to maintain resilience. Part of the reason that it's, we talk about the definition of resilience is the engineers will build us anything we tell them to. Right? The problem isn't the definition of resilience. The problem is how much money do you have? Right? Efficiency is the enemy of resilience. Right? We lost that reserve margin, went from 35% to 15%. And the result is I have 9 challenges in 3 years. But it's way more efficient to not have that overhang of capacity. So efficiency and resilience are enemies of each other. So the question is, how much would you like to spend? What can you afford? It's like buying life insurance. Well, if I don't die, I don't need much. Right? If I'm going to die, and I know it, I'd like to have a lot so that my kids can live happily ever after. So resilience is that same kind of problem. Right? How much do you want? If we tell the engineers, we want N-3 on all loads above 2,000 megawatts, they can go do that. They can bring us the answer. But we have to say how much we want before they can bring it back. The panel this morning, I felt like I should go home and go back to work because those ISOs aren't planning very well. I'd submit that we don't actually have a planning problem. We have an objective problem. The reason we don't get to answers that everybody agrees with is people's objectives are different. Lanny and I had a fist fight out in the bathroom. Those RTOs don't get along well. Well, that's simply not true. The simple fact is the objectives are different. If you're in Iowa and you're thinking about cost sharing with a transmission line in Kansas, and you're both trying to get your wind to market first, that's a dollar flow problem, not a power flow problem. Right? So until we can get the objectives so they line up so there's a policy consensus around it, the planners are going to be frustrated because we can't tell them what we'd like. That's pretty important. If we tell them what we like, they can build the plan, they can build the business case. The business case has to be robust. We just got approval, I guess we got 1 state left, on what we call our multi-value projects. It was $6.5 billion of new transmission investment. That at the time, those of you that speak rate base, there was only a $13 billion rate base, right? So it was a dramatic increase in investment in transmission because we had a policy consensus. The states involved said, yeah, we all built these RPSs. Let's move past that and talk about what's the minimum cost to achieve that policy. And the result was multi-state projects, $6.5 billion worth. Those were approved in 2011. The last one won't go in service until probably 2022. That's not a planner's problem, right? That's a regulatory problem, right? Planners can give us any answer we want, right? So then you have this cost allocation problem. And let's make a cartoon out of it so it's easy. Let's pretend there's a state who's really small. Say it's got 750,000 people total, the whole state. The number 1 piece of the economy is oil, natural gas. Number 3 is probably coal. We want them to share the cost of a transmission line to electrify transportation and turn coal off. That's 750,000 people who don't have a job. Shouldn't be a surprise they don't like the cost allocation that says you should help pay for this system. Right? So those parochial problems are the ones that are real. Cost allocation, dollar flow is the actual problem. That parochial versus collective action is a problem we've had in this country since the 13 colonies. Right? That's why we have the Congress and the Senate with different ways you elect your representatives. So it's that problem that we have to work on so that people see that collectively this is a less expensive way to do this and that they're not having to go home without being able to feed their kids. Right? So let's keep it real. Let's keep it real, and then people will follow us. But there's got to be something for everybody in this in order for it to make sense to spend that kind of money. The policy questions between state and federal, I actually think Order 1000 hurt us because it changed the balance. Now we've got a planning process that's federal and a siting process that's state by state. Well, that's not going to work, right? It's just that schism between state policy and federal policy is just true. Again, that goes back to the 13 colonies. It shouldn't surprise us a lot. So somehow we either put it back where it was, or the federal folks are going to have to talk about siting and routing so that the regulatory process and the planning process are in the same venue. So that actually hurt us. The multi-value projects were important because there was something for everybody. The incumbent utilities got something, the wind lobby got something, consumers got something, politicians got something, everybody got something. In an Order 1000 world where the incumbent utility doesn't probably get that investment, why are they going to say it's a good idea? Right? Who's the state going to ask if it's a good idea? They're going to ask the local utility. The local utility is like, yeah, I could build generation here, somebody else could build transmission. Well, that's an easy answer. Right? It's more resilient to go local generation. No, it's more resilient to go so we have to be clear-eyed about these kinds of dilemmas. Name them what they are so we can work on them. And then together, look for a way to reclaim that collectivism that is actually the way forward to actually have a long-term, resilient, low-cost, clean energy future. With that, I'm really looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I have some questions that they're ready, but I think for the sake of time, if someone already has a question, I'd encourage you to go to the microphone. In the meantime, I can ask the first question, and then I'll call on you once you get to the microphone, if that sounds like a good path forward. So Claire, I think you summed it up very well, this path forward about trying to get to the resilient grid and it being an objective problem, a policy problem. There's a lot of different ways to frame the problem, I would say. So, how do we communicate the value of resilience, knowing that I think Rod Cookrow had talked about there's the soft cell and the hard cell, and I guess resilience is in that hard cell space. You've got folks who just have different interests and different objectives, and I think you started to bring that path forward. But I was thinking there's trade-offs. So if you're you're looking at a certain objective, how do you evaluate the trade-off? And so I'm opening up to the panel, but I'm sort of looking at you, Chuck. Is there a way, when you look at the like the grading system that you have, you're looking at the entire energy sector? So can that be used to talk about the different trade-offs among the sectors, or just, I don't know, I thought maybe you could start us off, and then others from the panel can talk about the trade-offs.
Yeah, so we can carve up the grade if you want to into different subsectors. We have that level of understanding within our report card I failed to mention the failure to act piece, which is important from the electrical sector point of view, and that is, in 2016, we hired economists to look at what are the driving factors in our current infrastructure. Are we missing the boat on investing? And if we're missing the boat, what are we missing the boat in? Is it resilience? Is it overcoming aging? What are our missing points? And it was great to read the Wires and their Brattle study almost on top of our numbers. A little bit higher perhaps, but pretty close. So it kind of normalized where we were. We haven't yet gotten to the decarbonization piece. So that's got to be layered into this whole equation. So as we start thinking about needing to invest, we need to understand where. And I think, just to give you a little bit of a flavor, to communicate. So we've got regulators, we have customers, we have our own internal people to convince what are the right steps to move forward with. And so I took on a pretty important pilot. We've got a 29 kV system serving a critical customer. We put a solar system with batteries on it ahead of the meter, and then we instrumented it, so we have sensors on it, so we can monitor what's going on between the substation, solar, storage, customers, so we're managing that demand equation as well, and what's happening on that circuit, so that we can do some trade-offs. We can push back on the grid supply, see how the system reacts, see how our customer side reacts. Do we have any problems with voltage frequency? How does that look? What that kind of study does is give us, as a utility, which has to have that degree of rigidity to protect our customers, do the right thing, that move forward in technology. Can the technology help us avoid costs? Because storage on its own right now, I can't make that work on a replacement of an asset. So our regulator wants us to look at non-wire alternatives. Well, storage is a great fit for certain applications. We cannot make it fit head up to other forms of technology or just flat out replacement. So this kind of a pilot is what helps us advance. And by that data collection, willing to share it with our other host utilities, willing to share with our market participants who are very critical to the whole equation, that helps us all move the bar another notch forward. So I'll just leave it at that and say there are paths forward that we all need to start looking at. Instead of just dumping money in and replacing, how do we use technology to lever that hardening process, and how do we spend the money the right way? It communicates to our customers, our market, our ownership. Everyone learns from that same experience.
Thank you. Do other panelists?
Let me add, first of all, I'd like to answer the question Mike Scully asked the previous panel. What is the next big thing coming our way? In my opinion, it is the electrification of transportation. And ExxonMobil doesn't care when you fill up your car. They have storage at every corner, almost every gas station. We care in terms of when you do the charging. The electrification of transportation is a big asset to the grid in that it is mobile storage, and it could allow us to integrate much more wind and solar. And I'm not sure we know how to do that, because right now even the infrastructure bill that came out of the Senate says fast charging. We want to put $1 billion in fast charging. What we need is slow charging and better timing when the charging occurs on the system. So from a resiliency point of view, having that much load on the system that is demand controllable, to Charlie Smith's point earlier, could make a huge difference in the resiliency of the grid and the amount of renewables we can integrate.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would agree. I think that that is the biggest potential that we've got is, when you start talking about the potential for home electric vehicles to be hooked into some sort of a charger that maybe could be controlled by the local utility to correct for issues that are going on out there, I think that we could really start to solve some of our resiliency issues. But you've also got to take the cybersecurity and communications aspects into account on that, because there are also complications that can be introduced by it. But I would agree that I think that's probably, Terry, that's probably one of the things that could most impact our system over the next 5 to 10 years. I think something else that we need to do is we've got to get the public service commissions involved in the states. we've got to get them involved in this conversation. I think that FERC is involved. I think you've got other folks involved, but getting the public service commissions involved is going to be essential to solve the problem.
And it's likely to happen not because Tesla has made it more sexy in terms of the car, et cetera. It's likely to happen because electric motors are much more efficient than internal combustion engines. And ultimately, if we can prove the total system technology, and Craig Glazer in the back, we did a project at PJM to study 1,000 volts, not 1 kV, but 1,000 Chevy volts being controlled through OnStar. And yes, there's some cybersecurity issue there. However, we proved that with the software that's in the car itself and the communication links that almost every manufacturer has. And last week, Brenda and I got to see a 700 horsepower electric Mercedes. And so when you think about how much power and energy you can, how much faster you can accelerate, how much better the system would be if we electrified transportation, you get a feeling of how we can integrate renewables with that mobile storage.
Yeah, I see that as a potential solution to the duck curve problem too,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But it's not the 1.2 megawatt charging station that Volvo and Tesla is working on for 18-wheelers. Think of this, 65,000 trucks, that's about how many you would see on Highway 81 going to Florida and to New York Food. If you had that, that'd be the equivalent of Texas, ERCOT, 65,000 megawatts, 75,000 megawatts hooked to the grid. So it's not the supercharged fast charger. It's a slow optimized charge that we've got to work with the transportation industry and the owners of the electric vehicles to conquer.
Do you think we're sophisticated enough to, the vehicles are largely plugged in at night, right? And at weekends for perhaps school buses and the like. Are we sophisticated enough for analysis to be able to probabilistically understand when vehicles are actually able to charge back into the grid?
Yeah.
Most of the time they're sitting in car parking lots where you're traveling to and from work, etc.
Yeah, I think we are. I think it's as simple as telling the car what the price of electricity is.
Exactly.
Right, and I can do that for you on 5-minute intervals today.
Eh,
So the prices to devices is actually a real simple way to manage that demand.
And I think at some point, we're going to come up with a solution that wouldn't involve a plug-in, but maybe an induction type thing that would sit underneath the car when you drive in. That way you don't have to worry about somebody forgetting to plug it in. It's just in the garage, ready for available.
Or my kid pulling out without unplugging.
Exactly.
But really good companies, I'd give you a plug at work, like at PJM, and National Grid could consider that. If we want this to happen, we need to encourage that 22 hours a day, the car is not on the road. And if it's plugged in, we can optimize the charge rate. And admitted, we have to have a battery that does better than where we are today. But at the same time, that is a huge amount of power that we would increase our sales, increase our revenue, and at the same time reduce carbon.
I think your question is great, Brian, and the other piece of this is the electrification, right? We're going to start increasing the amount of electricity flowing. We somehow have to counteract that, and how we counteract that is time of use. So we've got all these smart meters, we've got them throughout our fleet. We're not using them to the way we could use them, and what it's going to take is shifting our consumers' use of the electricity, and how do we do that? We reward them, and so we reward them by looking at not charging your car during the day, perhaps even discharging that car battery during the day when our peaks are there, and actually charging at night. So it's going to really shift our whole way of using electricity, and maybe that electrification can be offset by those kind of efficiencies so that we don't have to build a lot more generation. And that really wins, I think, on all fronts.
I'd like to put a finer point on that. Part of the problem with the duck curve in California is they're still on the old-fashioned time of use rates, where they're paying people a premium when wholesale price of electricity is actually negative. Right, so that's what happens with the 12 hours on, 12 hours off kind of time of use. Those smart meters, if they're smart enough to take the price, when it's negative priced in California, they ought to be charging that stuff, right? But they don't, because the time of use rate that they'd pay is the old-fashioned time of use rate on peak. So it's a modest sophistication around getting the prices to the devices and frankly exposing consumers to the price. I mean, that's the part that's regulatorily hard. You start to subject them to the marginal price at any given moment. And that volatility is what we've always managed as a utility. We've always managed that volatility away so consumers didn't have to care. But if you want them to respond, you got to show them what the numbers are.
I kind of see it similar to what we've done with high deductible health plans, right?
Yeah.
So as people begin to see more and more about what their healthcare costs are and prescription costs and everything, they begin to make different choices rather than just assuming that it's all covered under one. I know it changed my entire
I don't mind the
approach to it.
generic one, yeah.
Yeah. Because it made a big difference for me.
Something I learned from the California ISO that kind of applies here, sitting down with their market design folks, and I've got a tremendous amount of respect for their chief economist there. If you look at where we are today, we're approaching energy too cheap to meter. We're seeing zero price in Texas, and then we're seeing $9,000 at peak. If I were CEO of ERCOT, I would retire and move to Hawaii. I've already done that, I'm sorry. But the point is, we're going to have to find market tools that pay for flexibility and pay for dependable capacity. If you cannot produce, if you're a gas plant and can't get gas, you shouldn't get paid on the winter peak. If you don't have flexibility, like you're dependent on the solar output, you should get paid less than if you have solar plus storage flexibility.
Which is kind of back to the value proposition of transmission. The more assets you can recruit to provide that flexibility, the lower the cost to achieve the high penetration future is going to be. Right? When cities, all the jobs used to be downtown. That's central station generation. All the roads went downtown. Jobs all moved to the suburbs. We didn't take any roads out. Right? We built more. Because the flexibility was required for transportation. As energy moves to the edge of the grid, that same flexibility is going to be required so that we can recruit all those things to minimize the cost of the flexibility that Terry talks about. And that's a really important thing and a really hard to quantify economically, which is back to the business case. We all like resilience, we all like flexibility, blah, 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 talk. Show me the money. So far, we haven't done a very good job of showing people the money.
Okay. Looks like we have a question. If you could give your name and organization.
Hi, I'm Mike Paul. I'm with the Canadian Electricity Association. Shifting from the very interesting conversation about zero rates, I want to find some of those in Ontario. But the on cybersecurity, there's I think it was really interesting points that were made about hostile actors trying to work their way in. But I was curious your thoughts on supply chain issues as well. There's obviously more and more technology that's going into the electricity system. It's being sourced from places that, or perhaps a couple steps back in the value chain, are not as always, we'll say, reliable as you might find in North America or Five Eyes countries for security issues. How are you planning for that in the future to balance the availability of technology and innovation and cost at the same time as security?
Okay, I have a couple of points on that. Actually, I have one generally on technology providers I wanted to mention as an opportunity. So earlier on, we talked about the Internet of Things. And one of the things I've seen, we've brought experts into executive panels for years at the ISO. And one of the reoccurring themes is a lot of the technology providers today for little bots and IoT gadgets, to be candid, they're just building crap. And when you have crap that doesn't have built-in cybersecurity awareness and resilience, then that's when you can have an army of LG refrigerators attacking your grid. So something stranger things have happened.
Yeah.
So something I'm interested in seeing would be just like we have standards for the safe electrical compliance, Underwriter Lab type certifications. Wouldn't it be nice if there was cybersecurity certifications when companies were pumping out cheap internet connected devices by the millions? They had a certain bar of quality they had to adhere to, which isn't exactly supply chain, but it's related. Another one was talking about the providers that actually provide technology to the electricity sector. And I sit on several panels with CEOs and operators from across North America. And there's a real concern that the providers of the technology that we use to run the systems don't always operate at the high standards. And it's not so much the big players. We had a speaker today from ABB that happens to be one of my suppliers. But there's quite a varying size and sophistication of suppliers of technology into the electricity sector. So if there was some standards, some minimum bar that we could set, and I'm also looking at maybe some repercussions. I don't think I've seen a situation where a technology provider, be it someone making IoT devices or a provider of technology to the electricity sector, provided something of poor quality that was ultimately hacked. Where is the regulatory penalty or the civil case against that individual? And I think maybe looking a little more on that side to see what can we do to encourage with a soft club some of these providers to have more accountability when they're providing key technologies in the sector supply chain.
Without stepping into the IoT issue, certainly we've developed a standard on supply chain that applies to certain assets that are on the system, and we're continuing to collect data to see whether or not there's additional things that need to be done there. And then issued a recent NERC alert to gather some data about specific foreign manufacturers and the penetration that they would have in the specific cyber areas. It's interesting, the more you talk about those issues and the more that folks ask why you're asking those questions, when you provide them a couple of scenarios, the light bulb goes on and they go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And so I think the more that we talk about cyber issues and the more we talk about supply chain issues, the more people will realize how important it is and how that needs to be embedded in part of our conversation about resilience.
And I can add to that too, Howard. That standard's been excellent for us because basically it's told our procurement people, this is a standard we have to live with. And oh, by the way, all that existing hardware we have, all those ICSs that are vulnerable, if we keep adding those, we're just going to add to the challenge we have going forward. So we need to strip those ICS vulnerabilities out, and that's a great way to do it.
But the other caution that I would say is, so some folks have said, well, maybe one quick solution to that is let's get away from microprocessor-based relays and go back to electromechanicals.
I could go back to work.
You hear all the sighs from that because there was a reason that we migrated to microprocessor-based relays. There are other issues that come with electromechanical relays. There's not a perfect solution to this. I think we've got to keep that in mind, that even when you're talking about EMP, that was a question that first came back with some folks is, hey, if you've got critical substations out there, let's just pull out all the microprocessor-based relays and go to electromechanical-based. And so the first question I had back was, okay, has anybody studied whether or not the dielectric constant in a capacitor is affected by these waveforms? And that was a head scratcher. They were like, well, we haven't looked at that. Well, then let's don't go out and yank them out because we don't know the solution yet. We can't take a knee-jerk reaction to some of these issues. We've got to, as it was said earlier today, let science help us understand what potential solutions we should go into and go into it with our eyes wide open.
Let me add to the relay. Clearly, transformers are our Achilles heel, but on the relaying front, we can harden electromechanical and digital relays in the same box, plug and play. There is only one place that I know that makes electromechanical in U.S. territories now, and that's Puerto Rico, GE plant there. So there's not a place to go buy those devices, and there's not enough relay test engineers set the relays and the drift that you have. So this idea of going back to electromechanical is not going to work. However, on critical facilities like black start capability, we talked about the HVDC being a point that you could push power into an area. One of the problems of our black start plan is we've never used one. We've never had to. In my 46 years in the business, we've never had a black start condition. We've only started from the fringe of the system. So ultimately, those black start critical resources have to be looked at much differently than the grid, just the part of the grid. You can't harden everything, but we can harden critical facilities. And something that surprised the heck out of me during Sandy and August 14, 2003 blackout, 50% of the hospital generators failed. The emergency generators. And we were evacuating hospitals in Manhattan and other places because of the failure of our microgrids, if you will. Now, I think the military bases will move towards microgrids, and perhaps with small nuclear reactors. I won't say SMRs because we normally think 100 megawatts, 150 megawatts on SMRs, but we will see microgrids develop. But we better test those things because if you look at it and only use it when there is an emergency, the odds of it working is about 50-50 from our hospital experience.
Well, I can tell that all of my panelists are very enthusiastic about resilience, and we could go on and on and on, but we are out of time. So I thought we should close with a bang and maybe just do a speed round from each of you on, if there was one thing you wanted our audience to remember about resilience, what do you want them to know? And Chuck, would you like to go first?
We're all ambassadors of resilience. I think we all have the obligation to serve our customers, serve humanity, and understand what resilience is and be able to distill what that means to them in terms of their reliance on electricity going forward. And if we don't do that training step and we don't reach out to our regulators, don't reach out to our customers, and get everybody on the same page, we're going to spend a lot of money uselessly and not get to the right equation of hardening our infrastructure.
I would like to challenge that we don't have a definition of resiliency. You heard the NERC definition. The National Academy came up with a definition. Terry Boston has a simple definition that he learned from John Cameron Swayze in the Timex commercial from my youth. Is the ability to take a licking and keep on ticking. Literally, we need to be thinking about the challenges that we're going to have, and the question you have to ask yourself, do you want society to survive the worst that a foreign nation state could throw at us? Do you want society to survive an EMP attack? And it's pretty simple question and pretty easy answer. So resiliency has to be a priority. And you mentioned the August 14, 2003 blackout. $3 billion a day, $5 billion a day is what that outage costs. So the cost of not having electricity is very high.
Great. So my messaging is very similar. Like I said in my call to action, if there's ever a time to invest in hardening critical infrastructure, it's now. So my takeaway would be continuing the good work. Resiliency is a top priority for the ISO in Ontario. We're planning what we need to do, working with transmitters and distributors, and just keep the messaging going. Make sure the governments, the politicians, the regulators understand the significance and importance of the work we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, I would say resiliency is more than system restoration. It's all aspects. And so when we plan the system, we need to plan the system for not just reliability, but for resiliency, for cybersecurity, and for physical security. And that all of those aspects need to be blended in place when we're trying to plan our system going forward.
So I'll try to put it all in one statement. Being both cyber and the electric grid, it's a three-legged stool. Harden, contain a problem when it occurs, and restore. That's whether it's any kind of attack, that's cyber, that's grid, that's the combination. Contain the damn problem. That's the most important. That's what we didn't do on August 13. We didn't contain it. Contain the problem, harden the system so the problems happen less frequently, and keep your act together in restoration.
Sounds good. So thank you. Jim, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. Let's give them a great big hand. Now, we have come to the end of our program. I have written a 20-page summary of issues I want to read to you. I'll spare you, however. But couple of things. We have videoed this entire meeting, and we hope to post it on the WIRE's website, and we will encourage other organizations to do the same. And we will post those of our panelists who had PowerPoints. We will post those as well. I'm delighted with the quality of the presentations, and we're just deeply grateful for the embassy staff that has supported this event. In particular, Adrian Rooney, who's our tech guy, Jesse Mitchell, Elizabeth Squirgle, and most of all, Andrew Daw, and many others actually. But it's been a great couple of days, and I know that all the organizations that were involved in planning this event are deeply grateful to the embassy, and WIRES is deeply grateful to each and every one of them. So thank you all for participating, and all I can say is it's about time we're all talking to each other, and maybe we do this again soon. Thank you.